Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show.
That is the sound of Hamas militants clashing on a highway in southern Israel with Israeli forces captured by a civilian caught in the crossfire. This is just one of the many clashes that took place over the weekend after a surprise attack by Hamas militants, launching some 5,000 rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel, followed by a ground incursion by Hamas militants into Israeli settlements just on the other side of the 25-mile open-air prison, as referred to both by Palestinians and Israeli authorities. And according to the Associated Press, 9 Americans were killed in the initial attack. This is sound captured by Al Jazeera during their news broadcast of the Israeli retaliatory strike ordered by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that has, according to the Israeli Defense Forces, struck some 500 targets that they claimed to be holding militants. But according to news reports, these targets included hospitals and schools inside of the Gaza Strip.
Very real situations. I mean, we've seen an emergency service worker there with a young child. We have a city that has seemingly been obliterated by multiple airstrikes. We know that Israel did confirm it hit 500 what it called terrorist targets. But as we've been hearing from our correspondents on the ground, there are schools and hospitals that may have been hit. And again, I'd just like to warn our audience.
The level of devastation and destruction that has been inflicted on Gaza because of the attack from Hamas shows that the Palestinian people are already paying an extremely high price for the actions of the Hamas militants. This is the sound of emergency workers in Gaza City attempting to rescue and recover Palestinian civilians, the victims of the retaliatory strike by the Benjamin Netanyahu regime as a result of the attacks by Hamas militants over the weekend. According to Axios.com, Benjamin Netanyahu has informed the White House on Sunday that Israel does not have any choice but to unleash a ground operation in Gaza, saying, quote, "We have to go in." Listen to this clip of Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant stating that he has ordered a complete siege on Gaza, also stating that Israel is fighting animals and that they intend on acting accordingly. I will be reading the translation as provided by the subtitles. We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. We are fighting animals and are acting accordingly. Notwithstanding the very direct genocidal language by referring to the Palestinian people inside of the Gaza Strip as animals, what he is calling for, Yoav Gallant, is calling for a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, which bans collective punishment in international law. Yet because of the images and the videos coming out of the horrific attack that was committed by the Hamas militants, that indiscriminately killed civilians, some 260 civilians killed at a music festival just on the other side of the Gaza Strip. And because of those images and images of other civilians being killed, images and videos of several women being raped by the Hamas militants, along with images of children who were killed, the far right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu has been given significant latitude from the international community as to how much indiscriminate violence they rain down on the Palestinian people collectively in retaliation for the surprise attack committed by Hamas militants over the weekend. The Biden administration, for their part, released the following statement saying, quote, "This morning I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu about the horrific and ongoing attacks in Israel. The United States unequivocally condemns this appalling assault against Israel by Hamas terrorists from Gaza, and I made it clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu that we stand ready to offer all appropriate means of support to the government and the people of Israel. Terrorism is never justified. Israel has a right to defend itself and its people. The United States warns against any other party hostile to Israel seeking advantage in this situation. My administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering. End quote. And for their part, the Republican Party here in the United States has never found a crisis that they are unwilling to exploit for their political gain. Listen to this clip of Republican Party Chair Ronna Romney McDaniel as she states that the conflict between Israel and Gaza is an excellent opportunity for Republicans.
Absolutely. I think this is a great opportunity for our candidates to contrast where Republicans have stood with Israel time and time again.
Now, taking consideration the statement that I just read from President Joe Biden stating that his administration and the United States of America unequivocally stands with the state of Israel. And keep in mind, this is despite Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant stating that they intend on violating Geneva Conventions in order to impose collective punishment on the Palestinian people for what Hamas did. Despite that, the administration has stated that they are standing unequivocally with Israel, but that's insufficient for Ronna McDaniel, and it's apparently insufficient for the Republican candidates for president. Listen to the sound from former President Donald Trump, as well as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former Vice President Mike Pence, as they all try to posture themselves as being more supportive of Israel than the Biden administration.
The Israeli attack was made because we are perceived as being weak and ineffective and with a really weak leader.
The Iranians are funding Hamas and Hezbollah and all these groups, and they're funding it in part with money that they've gotten because of the Biden administration's weak policies.
This is what happens when you have a president like Joe Biden. I also believe this is what happens when you have leaders in the Republican Party that are signaling retreat on the world stage.
Now, pay close attention to the talking point that Ron DeSantis just forwarded. It is the same talking point that has been regurgitated and recycled all across social media from conservatives in their echo chamber, stating that this surprise attack by Hamas militants over the weekend was partially funded by the $6 billion the Biden administration used in a prisoner swap with Iran. Here is Secretary of State Anthony Blinken responding to these claims on State of the Union on CNN this weekend.
The facts are these. No U.S. Taxpayer dollars were involved. These were Iranian resources that Iran had accumulated from the sale of its oil that were stuck in a bank in South Korea. They have had from day one, under our law, under our sanctions, the right to use these monies for humanitarian purposes. They were moved from one account to another in another country to facilitate that use. As of now, not a single dollar has been spent from that account. And again, the account is closely regulated by the U.S. Treasury Department, so it can only be used for things like food, medicine, medical equipment. That's what this is about. And by the way, the previous administration set up a very similar mechanism to enable Iran to use its oil proceeds that were blocked in various places or stuck in various places for humanitarian purposes. So people are either misinformed or they're misinforming. Either way, it's wrong.
Either people are misinformed or they are misinforming. Either way, it is wrong. It is so wrong, yet so popular in conservative circles and the conservative echo chamber that Fox News itself had to debunk the lie. Listen to this clip.
The $6 billion is still currently held in a Qatari bank account with U.S. Treasury oversight. The money came from Iranian oil sales to South Korea and did not include U.S. taxpayer dollars. NSC spokesperson Adrian Watson said in a statement, quote, "Not a single cent from these funds has been spent yet, and when it is spent, it can only be spent on things like food and medicine for the Iranian people. These funds have absolutely nothing to do with the horrific attacks today, and this is not the time to spread disinformation."
So while Republicans are doing their standard operating procedure, which is lying and using propaganda to try to blame Democrats for everything, Democrats are simultaneously doing everything they can to let Israel know that they stand with them, despite the fact that Israel is currently engaging in Geneva Convention violations through collective punishment of all Palestinians in Gaza as a result of what Hamas did over the weekend. All right, coming up after the break, newspapers in Israel are asking the question, was it an intelligence failure or intelligence ignored by the Netanyahu regime? More of the Benjamin Dixon Show after this break.
I'm in sync with the earth, 10 toes die, I'ma ride for the squad. Light up tires in the hearse. I've been on the vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I'm never so packed for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson.
Welcome back to the Benjamin Dixon Show.
Yep.
Visit us online at thebenjamindixonshow.com.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Coming up later in today's episode, I will be playing a clip of far right-wing Christian nationalist pastor Greg Locke, who made his entire church and congregation a name off of Donald Trump, forwarding the idea that he believes that the Gaza Strip should be leveled and turned into a parking lot. He did this while preaching from his pulpit, draped in a flag of Israel. Later on today's episode, we will talk about the eschatology of fascism, the second coming of Christ as preached by religious extremists here in the United States who pretend to love Jewish people, but the reality is something far grimmer. We'll discuss that later in today's episode, and also later in this episode, we will be discussing the failure of intelligence on the part of the Benjamin Netanyahu administration. Questions are arising as to whether or not it was a failure in intelligence or intelligence that was ignored. And this is coming from two papers in Israel. But first, I feel that it is important for you to understand the background of what's happening in Gaza and the reality of the living conditions of the Palestinian people who are trapped there, who are unable to leave despite being told to leave by the Netanyahu regime. I want us to really take in consideration not only their living conditions, but who they are. These 2.2 million people, where nearly 50% of them are under the age of 18. This audio is prepared and provided by Means.tv.
Gaza Strip is only 25 miles long and about 5 miles wide. 2 million Palestinians live packed into this tiny space, one of the most densely populated places in the world. Half are children. Many live in refugee camps speckled throughout the besieged territory. A stunning 80% of the population relies on foreign aid. Aptly called an open-air prison, there are only two ways to leave the enclosed area: the Erez crossing into Israeli territory and the Rafah crossing, which goes to Egypt. Both are completely controlled by hostile militaries. What Israel calls a border is actually a heavily militarized perimeter fence comprised of barbed wire, surveillance networks, and lethal no-go zones. If you roam too close to the so-called no-go zone, which extends 300 meters out from the fence, Israeli forces have authorized themselves to shoot to kill. Thousands of unarmed Palestinians have been shot for violating this rule in 2018 alone. The same goes for Gaza's coastline. It is the only place in the world where you can't even flee by boat, as refugees elsewhere often do. Fishermen are restricted to only a few nautical miles from their shore. Straying past that, even by accident, you can be blown out of the water by Israeli warships. A massive seawall in the north and south, currently being extended, boxes them into their small sliver of sea. This violence is compounded by an economic blockade that imposes a chokehold of poverty on Gaza, resulting in one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, according to the World Bank. 70% of the youth are unemployed, with 52% for the general population.
Now, before I go any further, I think it's important that I make a few statements and make them extremely clear. Hamas is not Palestine. Palestine is greater than Hamas. In fact, Hamas has been guilty of some of the most brutal oppression of the Palestinian people, and their actions have led to thousands of Palestinians being slaughtered because of the decisions of Hamas. Hamas is not Palestine. Hamas is made up of young Palestinian men who have grown up underneath the conditions that you just heard. Hamas is made up of young Palestinian men who have seen their brothers, their mothers, their sisters, their fathers be treated like the very animals that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called them. They are a people who have been underneath occupation for years. Entire families have grown up underneath this occupation and these brutal conditions. And so, yes, it is a ripe ground for recruiting people who will engage in the extremism that we saw this weekend. But you cannot look at what happened this weekend and take it out of context of the conditions imposed upon the Palestinian people by the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Here is Mehdi Hassan of MSNBC explaining the conditions of the average Palestinian.
Because what happened in Israel was horrific, deadly, heartbreaking. And the Israeli government is obviously going to retaliate, as you mentioned there. There have already been retaliatory airstrikes, but there's talk of escalation, of a ground invasion, of, exacting a price. And you have to understand, when we talk about Gaza in the West, for a lot of people, it's very easy to conflate Hamas, which is a militant group that carries out acts of vicious terror, as they did this weekend, with Gaza, which is a place that contains 2.2 million people, Alex, half of them children. Half of the 2.2 million people are children, and it's one of the most densely populated places on planet Earth. You've got 2.2 million people crowded into 141 square miles. So they automatically become the victims of Israeli airstrikes because it's so crowded, because it's so densely populated. And it's basically like living, Alex, in an open-air prison. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of the former head of Israeli intelligence just a few months ago, Tamir Pardo. He said, "We're treating Gaza like an open-air prison." So that is the context. It is so important for us to remember when we talk about Gaza as some kind of, strange, faraway place, people shouting with guns. It's actually a real place with real people, families, and they're living in horrific conditions, Alex. 59% of Gazans live in poverty, 63% food insecure, 70% of young people unemployed, 90% of Gazans have no access to clean drinking water. The UN Secretary General called it hell on earth. How much more hellish is it going to get in the coming days?
Well, if history is any indicator, Mehdi, it's getting ready to get a lot more hellish for the Palestinian people. The asymmetrical nature of the conflict between Israel and Palestine is best evidenced by the number of people who were killed in retaliation by Israel on Palestine. And I think one of the most starkest contrasts would be the 2018 conflict, where you have 130 Israelis who died in the conflict compared to 31,558 Palestinians who died in the conflict. In 2019, 133 were killed on the Israeli side. 15,628 were killed on the Palestinian side. Go back in time to 2014, 2,796 Israelis were killed compared to the 19,860 Palestinians who died. We can see throughout history that when Israel strikes back, they strike with a disproportionate amount of force that obliterates the Palestinian people, creating the next generation of recruits for militant organizations like Hamas. And so the question that I have is for people like Benjamin Netanyahu and people like Ben Shapiro, the American commentator of Jewish descent, who is actively online inflaming this situation, disregarding the lives of Palestinians. My question for them is, how many Palestinians have to die this time? And what's usually frustrating about these conversations is the follow-up question that is always asked: doesn't Israel have the right to protect itself? Even as Israel has a right to defend itself, the question is, when is enough enough? At what point have you taken enough lives to satisfy your retaliation ratio, or what I call the revenge ratio? What is the number, Ben Shapiro or Benjamin Netanyahu? How many Palestinian children have to die? If we look at a different number, the numbers that I just gave you were combatants, but I want you to take in consideration the number of children and civilians who have died in several operations, showing a very stark and a very dark revenge ratio. In the conflict in 2008 and 2009, approximately 3 Israeli civilians were killed. 295 Palestinian civilians were killed. That's a 98-to-1 ratio. In 2014, 6 Israeli civilians were killed. 1,462 Palestinian civilians were killed. That's a 244-1 ratio. In 2021, in the May conflict, 2 Israeli civilians were killed for 65 Palestinian civilians. That's a 32.5-1 ratio. I'm wondering, what will the ratio be when this conflict is over? How many Palestinians will die, both as a result of the actions of Hamas, as well as the revenge ratio that is exacted from Palestinians by the Israeli government every single time they have a conflict, and they have a conflict almost every year. And if you want to understand why half of their 2.2 million population are children, that's because of how many military-age young men are killed in each of these operations. All right, when we come back, we have to discuss the intelligence failure, or rather, was it intelligence being ignored? And Donald Trump's leak of intelligence to Russians that they believe now has found its way to Iran, helping Hamas. More of the Benjamin Dixon Show after this break.
The world going through it outside, they unruly, but I keep it cool, they can't press me. I keep it pure with intention. They see what I'm on, ain't no vixen. I might slide through with that top down. I keep it tuned with a high power. Put it on me, I'm blessed. Blessed. Big bag, manifest the sky, no stress. Keep no evil around me, can't ground me. I built it since when I had less. No hex on God, can't pause. Look at how far we progress.
Welcome back to the Benjamin Dixon Show. Visit us online at thebenjamindixonshow.com.
Welcome back. Welcome back. I want to read for you from 2 papers in Israel so that you can ascertain the position of different voices in Israel. The first is from Haaretz, and it reads as follows: "The disaster that befell Israel is the clear responsibility of one person, Benjamin Netanyahu. The prime minister, who has prided himself on his vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom in security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers he was consciously leading Israel into when establishing a government of annexation and dispossession, while embracing a foreign policy that openly ignored the existence and the rights of Palestinians." End quote. It's important to hear these voices because oftentimes when we speak about Israel, people speak collectively as if they are a monolith. Just like when people speak about Jewish people, they equate Jewish people with the right-wing government of Israel. There are dissenting voices in Israel, not only right now today, even in reaction to what Hamas did. There are Israeli voices, Jewish people who are still standing for the Palestinian people in the face of the horror that was brought down on them by Hamas. So it's important to realize that Israel is no more a monolith than the United States of America, and that the Israeli government does not equal the Jewish people. Here's a report from the Times of Israel. Headline states, Egypt intelligence official says Israel ignored repeated warnings of, quote, something big. And it reads as follows, quote, "Mounting questions over Israel's massive intelligence failure to anticipate and prepare for a surprise Hamas assault were compounded Monday when an Egyptian intelligence official said that the Jerusalem had ignored repeated warnings that the Gaza-based terror group was planning something big, which included an apparent direct notice from Cairo's intelligence minister to the prime minister. The Egyptian official said Egypt, which often serves as a mediator between Israel and Hamas, has spoken repeatedly with the Israelis about something big without elaborating. He said Israeli officials were focused on the West Bank and played down the threat from Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government is made up of supporters of West Bank settlers who have demanded a security crackdown there in the face of a rising tide of violence over the last 18 months. Quote, "We have warned them an explosion of the situation is coming, and very soon, and it would be big, but they underestimated such warnings," the official, who spoke under the condition of anonymity because he wasn't authorized to discuss the content of sensitive intelligence discussions with the media, told the Associated Press. In one of the said warnings, Egypt's intelligence minister, General Abbas Kamel, personally called Netanyahu only 10 days before the massive attack that Gazans were likely to do, quote, something unusual, a terrible operation, according to the news site. Unnamed Egyptian officials told the site that they were shocked by Netanyahu's indifference to the news and said the premier told the minister of the military was submerged in troubles in the West Bank. So my question is, was this a failure in intelligence, or was this intelligence ignored? It seems very unlikely that an intelligence agency that has such a secure perimeter around the Gaza Strip, with surveillance and intelligence coming from all sources, all types of sources, and all of their resources and assets in the region, that they had no idea this was coming. If that is the case, that represents one of the greatest failures in intelligence history. Now, according to this Egyptian official, it also sounds like this could be a case of intelligence that was ignored, eerily reminiscent of 9/11. And I bring this up because all over the weekend, we have seen the assertion that the attacks by Hamas on Israel was Israel's 9/11. I wonder if that includes intelligence that was ignored, giving George W. Bush the latitude that he needed to carry out his war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, why would I bring this up? Well, not only because it's being reported by the Times of Israel, the Associated Press, and coming from Egyptian intelligence officials. I bring this up also because I have to ask the question, who is the biggest beneficiary of the current lay of the land? It's not Hamas. They're going to be destroyed. It's not the Palestinian people. They are going to suffer an unimaginable, hellish landscape over the next coming months. It's not the average Israeli citizen, because they are caught in this conflict, and they are just coming off of a massive protest against Benjamin Netanyahu because of the Supreme Court reforms that he forced on the Israeli people, leading to hundreds of thousands of Israelis marching in the street against the far right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And now all of those voices have been diminished because of the mobilization that is currently taking place. Again, it is highly irresponsible to look at the Israeli people as a monolith when they have as much dissent in their domestic politics as we have in the United States. According to the Associated Press, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was facing a corruption trial that has resumed. And I want to read this from the Associated Press, dated April 27, 2023. Quote, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial has resumed after a month-long break, refocusing the spotlight on the long-serving leader's legal woes after a wave of protest over his government's plan to overhaul the country's judiciary. Netanyahu was charged with fraud, breach of trust, and accepting bribes in 3 separate scandals involving powerful media moguls and wealthy associates, and he, of course, denies wrongdoing, end quote. So I have to ask the question, was this a failure of intelligence, or was this intelligence intentionally ignored? And if so, why? Why would Benjamin Netanyahu have a 10-day lead on this attack and do nothing about it? Well, I'll let you think about that and come up with your own conclusions. What I know for certain is that there are a lot of people who are currently dying and a lot more who are going to die. What I know for certain is that Hamas has not been a good force for the Palestinian people, even though they control with a brutal iron fist the Palestinian people who are trapped in the Gaza. And when I consider the fact that there are 2.2 million people who are now running back and forth from one shelter to the next because they can't leave, but they have been told to evacuate. So they are constantly on the move right now. Palestinian women and children, fathers and brothers, they are constantly on the move right now from one place to another, from one end of this 25-mile strip to the other end, in order to find shelter away from the retaliatory forces of Benjamin Netanyahu. I know that Hamas killed women and children and deserve no credit from us as leftists, as progressives, or even as people who stand in complete in solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And actually, let me speak for me. Hamas does not get my respect. In fact, Hamas gets my total and absolute condemnation because of what they did this weekend, and also because of how barbaric they have been against the Palestinian people themselves. But what I do know right now are women and children, particularly the children, particularly the children. Because as I've covered this story for years, the conflicts that I have seen just in the time that I have been covering it over the last 10 years, it is the images of the children, not just the children who are killed and their bodies are devastated in the streets. It's not just that breaks me. It's the children that survive that breaks me, because they're left on their own in this city, in this strip, to fend for themselves because their brothers, their uncles, their dads, their mothers were killed in the last conflict. And they seem to have one of these conflicts every year, if not every other year. And so there always is a new group of traumatized children who witness their loved ones get killed by a retaliatory strike by Israel, only to survive and come into a world where 90% of them don't have access to clean water. An obscene amount of them cannot get employment because of the unemployment rate. They only survive with foreign aid that is currently being cut off because of what Hamas did. They can't leave through the north through Israel, and they can't leave through the south through Egypt, and they can't leave by way of the sea. They are trapped in an open air prison, and now they have to face another retaliation because of what Hamas did. We'll be back after this.
For so long that I'm scared I can't sit down. Seem like the more I fly, the more they try to take me down. I call your phone, I treat your voice like it's my favorite sound. Your face the only piece I've known, I'm just gonna face it now. But I try to be.
Welcome back to The Benjamin Dixon Show. Visit us online at thebenjamindixonshow.com.
Welcome back. Welcome back. The next clip is disturbing, and it is brought to us by none other than far right-wing extremist Christian nationalist pastor by the name of Greg Locke, who built his entire brand, his entire congregation, after taking that Baptist congregation away from the Baptist members and changing the name of the church to his own personal brand. He built his entire brand off of Donald Trump. Here's what he had to say in a service yesterday, flanked by a bunch of flags of the Israeli government. I want you to listen to what is being preached by these types of evangelical zealots who claim to love Israel. They claim to love Jewish people. But when we get into the actual theology or the eschatology, the end times prophecy that they believe in, the reason they support Israel is far darker than any commitment to the Jewish people.
Israel should make the Gaza Strip a parking lot by this time next week. Destroy the whole thing. And anybody that's going to support this Hamas nonsense. Listen, Joe Biden ought to be tried for treason. You understand that? Now, I get it. Obama's the real president behind him anyhow, and so he's the one that ought to be tried for treason. So I hope Netanyahu's a leader and he just mows the whole thing down by this time next week. If you think all this open border stuff is not an opportunity for a bunch of Hamas sleeper cells to come into this nation right now and start killing innocent men, women, and children, you have lost your mind. I'm sick of all these Christians saying we ought to have peace with Islam. Islam is a satanic death cult, and they would cut your head off before I said amen in this sermon if they had a chance to. The Muslim religion hates Jewish people to the core of who they are. What they ought to do is evacuate up there on the hill and get a great big missile and blow that wicked Dome of the Rock plumb off of the spot where it's standing right now, so we can get that third temple rebuilt and usher in the coming of Jesus.
There it is. That's the reveal. I'll get to the eschatology of fascists in a minute, because this really is the support white evangelicals have for Israel is 100% rooted in their desire to usher in the end times and the war of Armageddon. Okay. But before I get into the eschatology, can I just say, as a person who's grown up in church, and I have been a musician in church, and I'm currently a pastor of the church, that this has to be one of the most sadistic usages of worship music that I have ever encountered in my life, to have the soft, somber music playing underneath Greg Locke's fascistic call for genocide.
Israel should make the Gaza Strip a parking lot by this time next week. Destroy the whole thing.
Do you hear the somber music? Like, this is music. As a musician, as a person who's served in the ministry of music, this is the type of music that we play in a church to set the atmosphere for people to hear from God. And what do they do with this music? This is why you shouldn't let white nationalists, white Christian nationalists co-opt stuff from black churches, because this is rooted. This was created in the black Christian experience. They took it, and what do they do with it? They use it to call for genocide. The sheer sociopathy on display at these white evangelical churches. All right, let me just get to the last part of what he said. You heard it at the end. They believe, evangelicals believe, that according to their interpretation of the book of Revelations, that Israel plays a crucial role in the end time events, including the Battle of Armageddon, which they believe is going to take place in Israel. They also believe, and a key component of their religious belief is that Jesus will not return until certain events in Israel occur, such as the rebuilding of the third temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Supporting Israel in this perspective, they believe, expedites Christ's second coming. And when you really consider that perspective, all of a sudden, the fact that so many right-wingers, Christian evangelicals and Christian nationalists, are simultaneously some of the most anti-Semitic people on the face of the planet, but also get away with claiming that they support Israel. Well, it really makes sense, because they're only supporting Israel because they see it as a method of executing their agenda of expediting and hastening the return of Jesus Christ, at which point they believe that Jesus is going to condemn all of the Jews who did not convert to Christianity, particularly the Christian nationalist version of Christianity. They believe they're going to die and go to hell. They believe I'm going to hell as well, because I don't subscribe to their particular interpretation of Christianity. So I just want you to know they're equal opportunists when it comes to condemning folks to hell who don't subscribe to their very particular version of the Bible and their very particular version of eschatology, or the study of the second coming of Christ. They believe that the Jewish people are critical for ushering in the second coming of Christ. And that's why Greg Locke just called for the building of the third temple at the Temple Mount. And this type of teaching that is also rooted in just outright Islamophobia for the purposes of creating a villain. This, if I could take a real quick segue, this is also why I always look at any Muslim person who is supporting the Christian nationalist movement against the LGBTQIA community. I mean, I get the common thread of preaching and teaching against homosexuality that is found in the Islamic faith as well as in the Christian faith. But I always look amazed at people who would align with folks who at the end of the day are like Greg Locke, who are going to look at you and say, even though we align against the LGBTQIA community, I still think that, according to Greg Locke, he believes that Israel should flatten the Gaza Strip. He believes that Muslims are inherently evil. So I always look with a side eye to any of my brothers and sisters from the Islamic faith who I see out at these protests standing side by side with Christian nationalists, because you have a common disdain for the LGBTQI community. I wonder if you really realize that just because yesterday they stood beside you, people like Greg Locke stood beside you, doesn't mean that tomorrow they won't turn on you and go right back to ye old Islamophobia that was made so popular after 9/11 by people like George W. Bush and other Christian evangelicals across this country. Folks, there's so much more to cover. And in fact, I have a whole nother episode that I'm going to try to record today, because it's something that I really want to say. But we're going to stop here. Patrons, thank you so much for your continued support. I will be dropping some extra content for patrons only throughout this week. Patreon.com/The BPD Show. I want to encourage everyone to do what you can to survive the onslaught of horrible things that are happening in this world. The catalog of traumas that is being filled up in every nation across this planet. So much sorrow, so many tragedies, human-made and natural. There are just so many difficult things that are happening in this moment in world history. Last week had to be one of the most significant weeks in world history. There is a lot that is happening, and we must keep our wits, our heads about us so that we can navigate through this chaos, even when the chaos is the point. Keep your eye out for more content throughout this week. I love you, and I mean it, and I'll see you next time.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.